Well, let's get started with Joshua and welcome to Content, Context, Users, and Inclusive Design. And I'll read Joshua's bio for you. Joshua Randall is a user experience designer with a passion for digital accessibility. He began his career as an IT business analyst working for large corporations across industries, including financial services, healthcare, and chemicals. Most recently, he was the director of the design practice at an agency focused on business-to-business e-commerce. And Joshua's next role will be as product designer at RevLocal, which provides local digital marketing services to small businesses. Joshua holds a master's degree in user experience design from Kent State University, serves as president of the board of the Cleveland chapter of the User Experience Professionals Association, UXPA, and he also co-organizes the Cleveland Accessibility Meetup. So Joshua, over to you. I'm going to mute and stop my video. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Debbie. Thank you very much for everyone also who is here to hear my presentation on content, context, users, and inclusive design. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So you heard a little bit about me from the introduction, but I will tell you a little bit more about the genesis of this particular presentation. And then I will spend a few minutes on some key terms that I think we all need to have straight in our minds, which are digital accessibility, inclusive design, and universal design. I'll spend about 10 minutes on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG, which are the de facto industry standard that we work with. And I will explain the POUR model, P-O-U-R, which stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. That's the core principles of the WCAG. I'm then going to transition into talking about the information architecture framework, the content, context, and users, and how those terms map onto inclusive design. And finally, I will sum things up and I will take your questions. I usually say at this point that I'm an old-fashioned guy, so save your questions for the end. I think you have to because I think you are all muted. So we'll keep going here. I know everyone's going to want the slide deck, so here it is. It is at tinyurl.com/concentric-randall-2021. So it's tinyurl.com, and then it's the word concentric as in this conference, my last name, and the year we're in, separated by hyphens. You are free to reference that. Please don't share it, obviously, without my permission, the usual stuff. Couple disclaimers before we dive in. I am only speaking for myself. I'm not representing any of my past nor future employers, so not speaking on behalf of RevLocal, just on behalf of Joshua. Also, there are, of course, some legal aspects to accessibility and inclusive design, particularly where it intersects with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have a general understanding of the law, but I certainly can't give legal advice. If you need legal advice, talk to a lawyer. And this is primarily an informational presentation, not a how-to. There will be a couple of places where I give you specific how-to advice, but I have a different presentation that's more of a how-to. If you're interested in that, please contact me. Okay, we'll skip over all that. I'm here to talk about accessibility. You heard my bio. I'm trying to link up accessibility with information architecture, but you're going to see this crazy diagram again at the end, and I was deliberately only going to show it briefly. So the joke is I started drawing on the wall like somebody in a TV show with strings and push pins and stuff, and this is what I came up with. Because I'm a big nerd, and probably we're all big nerds to be here this morning, but I really appreciate you putting up with me and with the technical difficulties. Okay. Let's go over some terms. So digital accessibility, inclusive design, and universal design. The way I see this is these things are interrelated and kind of nest within one another. I call this kind of a Venn diagram, although I suppose it's not really one because there's no separation, only nesting. If we took a really narrow view of accessibility, we could start with the legal basis, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or Section 508 conformance, which applies to federal government or businesses that do work for the federal government or on their behalf. And these are specific laws that you have to comply with. And again, this is the part where I say I generally understand them, but I certainly can't give legal advice. But let's take a broader view than legal requirements. And we look at the next part of the diagram here, and that's web accessibility. So we want to make the web more usable by people with different abilities. If we take an even broader view than that, we can expand it beyond the web to other types of digital assets like electronic documents, mobile apps, smart devices of various sorts, and who knows what else we will invent for ourselves in the future. We'll call that digital accessibility, and it's broader than just the web. Take an even broader view than that, we get to something called inclusive design, which is considering the range of human diversity when creating design. And the broadest view, at least in my view, is something called universal design, which is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for specialized adaptation or specialized design. So universal design is something that grew out of physical world architecture, but I think those principles can apply very nicely to the digital world that we now live in. Formal definition of digital accessibility: the ability of a website, mobile application, or electronic document to be easily navigated and understood by a wide range of users, including those users who have visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive disabilities. I want to emphasize that phrase, a wide range of users, and keep that in mind when we talk about information architecture in a little bit here. What is inclusive design? So I found two definitions for this that I think are helpful. The first one is from the Ontario College of Art and Design, or OCADU, and it says inclusive design means design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. I like that definition because of the emphasis on not just diversity in and of itself, but all the different ways that we can be diverse. And then the second definition of inclusive design comes from a website called inclusivedesignprinciples.org. So that's a .org website. And it says that inclusive design principles are about putting people first, about designing for the needs of people with permanent, temporary, situational, or changing disabilities. I wanted to underline there the permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities because that, again, is a concept that we will come back to in a little bit as we start relating inclusive design to information architecture. Okay, I promised I would talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. When we act on ideas of digital accessibility and inclusive design, we need something to refer to, and that's where the WCAG come in. The WCAG are a set of principles, guidelines, and success criteria that were established by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, which is the same group that makes standards like the HTML standard. And the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have become the de facto industry standard that we are following. Now, they had been on version 2.0 for many years, since 2008. That was updated to version 2.1 in 2018 to address some gaps around mobile technology, low vision, and cognitive disabilities. If you think back to 2008, mobile technology barely existed. And then over the years, there was the realization that not enough was being said about low vision and cognitive disabilities. So those were added in. There's a version 2.1, which is scheduled to become adopted this year. And there's even a version 3.0 in the works as well. But regardless of the versions, and they're all backwards compatible, the principles at the top remain the same. And those are the principles that form the mnemonic POUR, P-O-U-R, which stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Beneath those principles, we have a set of the actual guidelines themselves, and those are numbered with two numbers like 1.1 or 1.2, and it goes all the way up to 4.1. Now, we don't need to worry about this level of detail because I'm actually not going to go to that level. I want it to stay at the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust level. So let's talk a little bit more about those principles. So P for perceivable. It means that people can perceive the information and the user interface components regardless of what senses they have or don't have. Or to put this another way, perceivable means that we make our information available to many different senses, not just sight, but also including hearing and touch. Operable. O for operable. It means that people can act on the interface components. They can navigate the information space. They can explore it. They can transact on it. After all, a lot of what we do on the web is transactional. We give people multiple ways to determine where they are, how to get where they're going, and what to do when they get there. Understandable. That means just what it says, that people can understand the information being presented. It means we write using plain language and we apply consistent structure to what we write. And finally, R for robust. Robust means that people can continue to access our content even when the underlying technology changes, as we know that it inevitably will. 20 years ago, nobody had a smartphone. And 15 years ago, nobody was really talking to Siri or Alexa. 10 years ago, nobody had a smart watch. But these are all things that we take for granted now. And there's some other presentations at this Concentric conference about XR and all the cool stuff that's being done in that technology space. There will be technologies created that we cannot even imagine, but if we follow these principles and make our content robust, then it will continue to be accessible on those new technological platforms. Now, when we look at some of the words that the Web Accessibility Initiative uses to describe the principles, we see information, navigation, content. That sounds familiar. In fact, that sounds very much like the information architecture framework that I want to start to relate to the principles of inclusive design. And here is a true Venn diagram where they actually overlap and separate. And this is the famous diagram from the Polar Bear book, or the official name of it, Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. This is on page 32 of the 4th edition if you'd like to follow along at home. So content, context, and users. Content, the information itself and the presentation of that information are essential to understand the stuff that's on that website or in that app or in whatever that technological platform is. Context. Now, the diagram in the Polar Bear book refers to the business context in which the information architecture operates. When I started putting this presentation together, I thought, am I going to have to really shoehorn this into inclusive design context? But actually, if you read the paragraph that goes with this diagram, you'll find phrases like this about the context. You need to understand the contextual differences imposed by the channels that the user will be using to interact with. Will they be experiencing your services primarily via apps on mobile phones or via a website in a desktop-based browser? Devices with small screens are used at different times and places than those with larger screens. So the paragraph around context really expands it out from just business goals and politics and all that towards context of use, which is critical to inclusive design, and we'll see that in a little bit. And finally, of course, we have users. So the audience, the tasks, the needs, and so on that you see on the diagram here, it contains the words audience and experience, both of which are essential elements of design in general. Now you can see I'm starting to highlight some of the words on the slide here. And these are the ones that I want to emphasize as we relate the content, the context, and the users of information architecture to inclusive design. So I said the title of this talk is Content, Context, Users, and Inclusive Design, because after all, that's the way the words are presented in the Polar Bear book. But I'm actually going to invert that and start with users. Start with that age-old user experience design question of who are we designing for? We'll talk about our audience with an eye towards inclusive design. We'll talk about the scope of disabilities, how many people are affected, and why we should care about that. Then we will talk about context, and I want to come back to that concept of situational disabilities that we touched on before, and also talk briefly about stress cases and what happens when stress is introduced into the mix. And finally, I'll talk about content. Content is still the king of the U in understandable, and still critically important to have good structure around our content. Okay, let's begin with users, and let's think about the scope of disabilities and who is affected. So, I went a little too far. Sorry about that. So About 17.6% of people in the United States, that's over 55 million people, have a serious disability according to the definitions of the Social Security Administration. So don't just think about disabilities with seeing, which are sort of the most obvious ones, but think about people with difficulty grasping objects who may not be able to use a mouse or another pointing device, or maybe they have a hand tremor and they're not easily able to use a touch screen. And think about cognitive difficulties like attention deficit disorder or dyslexia that can make it difficult to understand information, particularly if there was not good information architecture applied. The worldwide percentage of people with disabilities is around 15%. That's over 1 billion people who are affected in one way or another. And don't just think about your customers, think about your employees as well. There's one thing that the last year has taught us, it is that technology is absolutely essential to your ability as an employee to contribute to the workplace. And so we need to make that inclusive and accessible to those employees and of course to customers as well. And then there's a self-interested reason to care about the scope of disabilities. And that is because in the words of Bruce Tognazzini, who was a former Apple designer, the famous Tog, he wrote, "We will all have disabilities eventually unless we die first." That's kind of a morbid way to put it, but he is absolutely right. If you live long enough, you will move into some type of situation where you're experiencing an age-related decline. It's inevitable. And the aging population is increasingly using the internet. People are living longer and longer, so we need to design for them and for our future selves. And finally, beyond those permanent disabilities, there's the concept of temporary and situational disabilities. I'm going to talk about that, but first I want to ask a really big question. And that question is, why should we care about accessibility and about inclusive design? Well, it's the right thing to do. Mic drop. Okay, maybe that's not compelling enough, particularly in a business context. So I will give you a variety of other reasons to care about accessibility. It improves your brand. We're in a world where you can share your opinions freely and vastly over the internet. If you have a bad experience, you might tweet about it, and that will reach hundreds of thousands or millions of people as it gets retweeted. Accessibility is a quality issue. If something is worth doing, it's worth doing well, is a cliche for a reason. If you are designing and developing and you're ignoring that 15 to 17% of people who have a disability, then I would argue that you're really not doing it that well and your quality could be vastly improved. Accessibility affects your B2B work, particularly as we think back to that Section 508 compliance. If you want to do work for the US federal government or probably down the chain, you're going to need to fill out something called a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template. And if you don't meet enough of those criteria, you're not going to get the job. Accessibility helps with search engine optimization. So there's an expert named David Berman who has written that the primary visitor to your website, or the most frequent visitor anyway, is blind, deaf, and has the cognitive abilities of a 4-year-old. He's referring to the Google spider. It can't see, it can't hear, and it's not very smart, but it absolutely loves accessible websites. And a lot of the accessibility work that we do is directly applicable to SEM and SEO as well. One example, HTML title elements. You should have one on every page. It should be short and unique. That's really going to help people with disabilities who are using assistive technology orient and locate themselves within your information space. And the Google spider will love that because that is going to subtly improve your page ranking. And then finally, accessibility supports low bandwidth users. We're here in this lovely high bandwidth environment, but the reality is that the entire world is not in a high bandwidth environment. And so there are things we can do to simplify information and simplify interactions to make it easier for people. And that's also going to help with accessibility. And of course, yes, it does reduce legal risk. There's a lot more I could say about this, but there's been an explosion of lawsuits over the last decade. If you are working for a big organization, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. All right. Situational disabilities and temporary and permanent disabilities. This is a chart from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, and this is how we're starting to relate to the context that people are in. I'm going to go through this fairly briefly, but the example that they give is, well, if you have a permanent disability with seeing, maybe you're blind, temporary disability might be cataracts, and a situational disability might be a distracted driver as you look away. I think being in bright sunlight is maybe a better example of that. You're struggling to see something on your smartphone screen in bright sunlight. You've got to turn up that contrast. Situational disability with hearing, they use the example, I think this is a weird one, of like being a bartender. I mean, yeah, okay, bars are loud, but maybe a more common one that we might actually run into is you're somewhere that you need to keep your volume down. You probably turn on closed captioning, even if you do not actually have the permanent disability with hearing where you're deaf or hard of hearing. So a lot of the accessibility innovations that have been made, like high contrast mode and closed captioning, are helpful to that situational or temporary disability. Another aspect of context is the technological context that we're in and our uses of assistive technology. Sarah Hendren has written that all technology is assistive technology. The monitor that you're viewing the presentation on and the speaker notes that I'm referring to are supplementing our ability to hear and to remember what I'm saying. And that's assistive technology. Screen readers, voice recognition, keyboards, mice, pointing devices, and all the other specialized things that you see listed here are pieces of assistive technology. And so that's a context in that IA sense that you need to keep in mind as you design and as you develop. I'll give you an example of where the technological constraints of the context that we are in can affect something every day, and that's the humble alarm clock. Everybody knows how an alarm clock works. You set it for a particular time, and then it alerts you when the time arrives. But think about the context of use and remember all the different modes of interaction that were listed on that Microsoft chart. Most of the time when the alarm goes off, by definition, it's dark and we can't see because we have our eyes closed. So that's a situational or temporary disability with seeing. So if the only thing the alarm did was light up or change colors, that would not be a very effective alarm. Okay, so we add sounds to the alarm, and that works for a lot of us, but some of us are heavy sleepers, this guy, or maybe we're somewhere noisy during the day and we don't hear the alarm, or maybe we have a permanent disability with hearing. Okay, so we can add haptics to our alarm, such as vibration, and Apple has done a really nice job of this on the Apple Watch, integrating sight, sound, and touch. But somebody could have a disability with touch, they could have nerve damage. And my point here is that there's no perfect solutions, only trade-offs you can make along the way. You're never going to get to 100% inclusive design or 100% accessible, but you can certainly do better than just having an alarm that lights up and didn't address the other senses. Ask yourself, where will the user be in what surroundings and what is their context of use as they interact with your app or device? And remember, not just permanent disabilities, but also temporary and situational ones as well. Stress. Stress devours your cognitive resources. That is when the context of use becomes incredibly important. Your mind has severely reduced processing power under stress. So it's vitally important that we crafted our information architecture in a way that's easy to understand. And the stressor doesn't have to be a life or death situation. It could just be you're running late or you're having technical glitches and then everybody gets stressed out. And we want to refer to these as stress cases, not as edge cases. You can see the reference here on the slide is to the book Designed for Real Life by Eric Meyer and Sarah Walker-Becher, who I hope I pronounced her name right. But they really encouraged us to think of these as stress cases and not as edge cases, because the thing about an edge case is you can say, well, it's at the edge, let's ignore it for now, and then ignoring it for now turns into forever. So let's call these stress cases, and we're not going to ignore stress because we know we have to deal with it every day. And finally, the last piece of the information architecture Venn diagram is, of course, content. The last piece, if we go in reverse order, that is. So it's still the king of the U in poor, the understandable, and one easy way to achieve understandability, just use plain language. Write the way you would speak and explain your jargon as you go. That's basic. Equally important is the structure into which you're putting your content. It's what turns a mass of words and images into some type of information. All those 5-paragraph essays that we wrote in grade school and those outlines with Roman numerals and letters, those are structuring content, and that is incredibly important on the web and in digital work as well. You start with a topic, you break it into main points, you break the main points into subpoints. That approach is really effective in chunking up information, not just for people with disabilities using a screen reader or some other type of assistive technology, but for everybody. And I can't resist one little how-to thing here, and that's, I talked about the title elements. I want to talk about the HTML heading elements, your H1 through your H6. Please, please, please use these the right way. They are that outline that you wrote in grade school. They go in order from 1 through 6. Please don't skip levels. Please don't use them just for styling. That's what your CSS is for. It's extremely confusing to people who are using assistive technology to encounter the heading levels out of order, or maybe there's no H1 and the page starts with an H3 and then goes to an H2. I mean, that's just a mess. Please don't do that. Okay, and as an example of that, we have the very nice concentric conference website. You know, way up on this page at the top, sort of out of my view here, there's an H1. There's a very nice navigation bar. You got an H2, an H3, and some H4 headings in order. Well done, bravo, that's the way it should be. Another piece of content is your landmark region. So this is getting a little bit more into the front-end development piece of this, but I think this is important to understand as we're thinking about that, you know, how do we structure our content? Well, we've got 30 years of web knowledge sort of ingrained in ourselves. We know there's going to be a banner at the top. There may be some, you know, left-hand nav if there's room for it. A main part of the page in the middle, maybe some stuff over on the right where there's a form or a search bar. Sometimes you'll see that at the top as well. And the content info section, which is the crazy name for the footer region at the bottom. So these landmarks are important to use, again, in a structured way that's going to make it easier for people to understand that massive information and turn it into something. If we were to look at this sort of sample page using a screen reader like NVDA, we would see each of those landmark regions gets split out, and the one that the complementary region on the right there has that form nested in it that has a search function nested within that. So then again, you can see the hierarchical nature of landmarks, somewhat conceptually similar to the H1 through H6 elements that we talked about. Okay. Here's that crazy diagram again, and here's how it all relates together. You've got the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, that poor mnemonic from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and then you have the content, the context, and the users of the information architecture book. So you see my crazy arrows connecting these together. We need to make things perceivable to people. That involves not just the structure of our content, but also thinking about the context in terms of maybe screen size or glare or noise, as we talked about. It involves thinking about our users, think about their sensory capabilities or whether they have any impairments thereof. Operable, our user interface elements. Again, think about context of use. Where are you, and what's the situation in which you're trying to interact with something? And of course, think about the user themselves and what ways will they be able to operate on your information. Understandability comes from navigation and structure and predictability and consistency. And I put robust at the bottom, kind of underlying everything, because adhering to standards like the HTML standard, like the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, that's going to ensure our forward compatibility with future technologies. In conclusion, accessibility, it's the right thing to do. It's part of quality. It has all those other benefits that I listed on the previous slide. Inclusive design, it means we're considering the range of human diversity and we're putting people first when we do our designs. The one way we can do that is by following that poor mnemonic, make things perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and to bring your information architecture in line with inclusive design. We're going to blend that poor concept with the content, the context of use, and the users that are the framework for information architecture. Whew, okay, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Apologies for the technical glitches. I now have a few minutes to take some questions if there are any.
And thank you so much. And of course, the technical glitches are totally my fault. We had all this set up with Zoom. We tested it. We bought extra licenses. This happened last year at our conference. We swore it wouldn't happen this year. And I'm so sorry it happened with you, Joshua. And thank you for coming back. Evidently, it happened. Darren got kicked out of his Zoom so many times. He didn't come back. So thank you for putting up with us on this. If anybody has questions, I'm going to check the chat room. Please do. I will shepherd the Q&A, and but of course, hopefully there's ways you can contact Joshua more directly if you would like.
Let me bring
Yes,
that up.
find
So
him.
I put on the screen my email address, my LinkedIn. I am on Twitter, although I mostly lurk. And there's the URL to this presentation if you'd like to refer to it. But please do contact me if you think of any questions. I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you so much.